It's 6 o'clock in London, it's 1 p.m. in New York, 1 a.m. in Hong Kong, 3 a.m. in Sydney, 10 a.m. in San Francisco, and 10:30 at night in Mumbai. Greetings, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are in the world today. My name is Patrick L. Young. The IPO-VID live stream. We're into series 14, episode 1. That's episode 79 in totality. Starts here. Gosh, exchanges leaping into brokerage. Now, there's something that was predicted, well, last millennium by some people who are writing books like Capital Market Revolution. But anyway, it's all very exciting, ladies and gentlemen, because CME are looking to make it happen for the first time for an exchange-traded derivatives marketplace. An interesting move, although, of course, the worry is all about the CCP side of the business. It's a potentially sound move to offer direct brokerage access to your market. The worrying bit is that CME likely will want to use the same CCP facilities, which are delivered, of course, ultimately in terms of modifications of rules. The FTX proposal, will they want to follow that, ladies and gentlemen? It'll be interesting to see. It's going to be rather crucial how the CFTC reacts to that. And indeed, we had a very interesting report by the Great and the Good just this week, which seems to suggest that they're rather worried about how all of this new digital architecture is coming into legacy markets from a systemic risk perspective. And overall, therefore, what will happen to CME's brokerage? That's a topic that's ongoing in Exchange Invest every day this week. Ping us a message in direct messages if you'd like to start your free trial. Meanwhile, another ongoing story this week. Well, it's been an embarrassing week for the multi-commodity exchange of India. And also, of course, the new London Marathon sponsors TCS. Yes, indeed. Tata Consultancy Services have announced that they are the new title sponsor of the London Marathon. Will this, I wonder, build on their recent services in the Exchange Paris? Perhaps akin to the TCS non-installation at MCX. If you hit the wall at 18 miles on the track during the marathon, therefore in the world of parish code delivery, you'll be allowed a few months respite. Will you get the same thing before you have to finish the marathon itself? However you look at it, the delivery of this new TCM system to MCX is indeed turning into a marathon in its own right. And the winner of the week was, of course, 63 Moons Technology. Jignesh Shah's company rises again with another 3-month SLA at a price tag that is rumoured to be somewhere around eye-watering. In better news this week, congratulations to IPO-VID alumnus, guest number 77, Katerina Karamashi. She's been promoted, if you remember, just 2 weeks ago. She was the global head of equity derivatives. She's now the VP of financial derivatives and equity derivatives combined. All the very best to you, Katerina. And indeed, hopefully we'll hear from you about your larger, broader, bigger portfolio in the near future. And indeed, thinking about ICE and thinking about Katerina, who was, of course, talking about her 21-year life story, Life with 2 Fs celebrated its 40th anniversary last week. It's quite curious, there were 0 official celebrations in the air. But yes, indeed, last Friday, 40 years ago, the then Bank of England Governor, Gordon Richardson, cut a ribbon hanging in the Royal Exchange and ceremonially preempted the first bell being rung to start trading at London's legendary, even though it's only 40 years to the day, Financial Futures Exchange. Life was founded after the International Petroleum Exchange, the London FOX, the LME, multiple other commodity exchanges within the square mile. And it followed the great floors of Chicago and New York as major titans of exchange commerce. Yet it lives on to this day, trading via the ether as a balance sheet powerhouse within the magnificent portfolio of ICE. Perhaps the big lesson to be taken from that whole episode is that with the rose tint of history, it all looked so obvious. Futures were a great idea, which succeeded on a smooth arc of acceptance to becoming mainstream. Yet, well, as the British government has been discovering this week, the force of reaction is powerful within the establishment when you try to change things. Even when Life traded its millionth contract on the 5th of August 1983, already many newspapers were writing the whole thing off as a failure. And before you start thinking that was just The Guardian, I would like to add it was places like The Economist too. From Life, from front to back, we come to today's guest. Paul Conn. He's going to be talking to us around the world from front office to back. Paul started his international financial career at the London Stock Exchange way back in 1979. He joined the National Stock Exchange of Australia, currently the Australian Stock Exchange, in 1989, holding a number of senior roles, including head of business development. Paul joined Computershare in 1998, relocated to New York in 2001, and was appointed president of Computershare's Capital Markets Group in 2006. Good evening, Paul. It's great to see you. Where in the world are you today?
Thank you, Patrick, and thank you for having me on your live stream. I'm based in New York, but I'm sitting in Computershare's London office. Hopefully you can see the gherkin in the background. So thanks for having me on.
It's a delight to see you. Good grief. It's a long time since we first met. I mean, that's, wow, gosh, a good 2 decades and a bit ago when you were living in Sydney. And you had a long and interesting career with the ASX when it was a computing technological powerhouse.
I did. I mean, I started my career in London decades ago, as you mentioned, in 1979 as quite a young man. I joined the Australian Stock Exchange in 1988 and spent almost a decade there. I worked with ASX through until the point at which ASX demutualized and became a for-profit organization. It was at that point when I was offered a really great opportunity to join the founder of Computershare to help with international expansion. So it was great. But at that point, through that period of late 80s through to certainly through the mid 90s was a really pivotal point for ASX. At that time, there was tremendous technology deployed to automate the trading system, and really smart technology deployed to automate the clearing and settlement system. And when those two systems were connected, it really transformed, from my perspective, the Australian market, and volumes exploded over the years that followed. And yeah, it's a very, very good story.
It's incredible, isn't it, to think that at a planning meeting in early 1987, somebody thought that an innocuous day in the calendar would be like a Monday, like say the middle of October, Monday, let's call it a Monday, October the 19th, shall we? And that was the day that they decided they were going to transfer all of the systems from the ASX floor to electronic for the equity market. And of course, that turned out to be Black Monday, as all historians of markets know. It must have been rather hairy, to put it mildly.
Well, I think the exchange went about the deployment of the automated trading system in a really smart way. So yes, these things are always hairy. These types of market adjustments, crashes, whatever you want to call them, they're always a concern. So, but the Australian Stock Exchange, I think, did very, very well and went on to deploy that system incredibly successfully and connected it to the CHESS platform. And that's where I think the core infrastructure was really, very, very smart from that point on.
Well, it's incredible because you look at the core infrastructure that you were putting in at that point, and I mean, not only was it going fully digital, but it was also at a point in time when other exchanges were either completely analog, and I mean, places like South Africa, for example, really had no coherent settlement system whatsoever. It was all on paper. And at the same time, you had, well, London had obviously, I mean, actually, I suppose it must have been around about the time you were with the London Stock Exchange when the Tourist debacle took place, and they couldn't even manage to build an electronic clearing and settlement system at that time.
Yeah, well, 2 comments there. First, just to round out the ASX story, I can't remember who actually published the study, but it may have been a World Federation of Exchanges or similar. They would basically rank settlement efficiency on a market by market basis, and they published a ranking. And prior to the implementation of these G30 recommendations, which came out in 1989, March 89, ASX, I think, was like 3rd least efficient or 3rd worst in the world of capital markets at that point. After a series of reforms to the settlement system, the Australian market jumped to the third most efficient. So it was tangible proof that these reforms, when implemented in a phased and logical way, can really deliver tangible benefits to the marketplace and to the economy. Going back to your comment about my time in London, I joined, as I mentioned earlier, in '79. I left in 1988. So I worked in the talisman settlement system, which is what the Taurus system was seeking to replace. I had a range of roles there. When I first started, I worked in the securities master file area, which was great because it was how I learned, what a security is, why equity is different from a debenture, different from a loan note, etc. And so I was coding new listings, and that was when I first started working with Chris Pryor-Williard, who was in the listings organization of the LSE at the time. He was the front office and I was part of the back office. But I had a range of different roles at the London Exchange. I worked in their corporate actions area, so that was again great learning. I was appointed to the role of the buying in official, which was great. When I first started, I was asked to kind of run around the floor to get prices from the jobbers, and that was good. And ultimately, when my boss, whose name was Vic Shaw, retired, I was appointed to the role of the buying in official, which was closing out transactions between counterparties where selling brokers didn't deliver their shares. So a buying broker would ask the LSE to go into the market and purchase the securities. So, that again, all of these things kind of taught me a little bit about how the marketplace operated, the processes where risk occurred, and so forth and so on. And
incredible. I mean, it's incredible history. And it's so interesting because people have forgotten all of these, what seem now to be quaintly arcane practices that took place across the market in those days. And I mean, the idea of having the buying in broker and going to the floor and having to enact settlement in order to allow for settlement failure. And actually, I mean, in this day and age, people don't even really have a coherent idea of just what settlement failure is, because it's so relatively rare that you really do have a problem. Whereas, of course, in those days, we had a 2-3 week account. We had the opportunity to trade throughout that period of time. And then there was, a week before you actually had to settle everything up. Totally different and very, very paper intensive world. And you mentioned someone close to all our hearts, Chris Pryor-Williard, much missed. Actually, it's funny, one of the very first people I wanted to come on this show was Chris, and he'd been sending me emails all the time. I mean, you just didn't notice any difference with Chris. And then it turned out that actually he'd had a stroke and he couldn't speak, but he was still super active all the way until just a few weeks before his death, which is so sad. He's a man who's hugely missed in the parish, and a lot of settlement expertise. I mean, quite incredible. It must have been incredible to work with him, even.
It was fun. It was a lot of fun. We formed quite a good team and worked together for a long period. But I was, lucky enough. The Taurus project was being run by a separate group of people, and I had left the UK to head back to Australia and was working for the ASX on implementing these G30 recommendations. And Taurus, I think, collapsed in 93 or thereabouts. So I was well into my ASX career at that point in time.
Yeah, you were well down the road with ASX and implementing the original chess, which is certainly done incredibly well to manage to survive as long as it has, which is quite awesome. So then tell us about moving to Computershare. And actually, for the benefit, in fact, let me just segue for one moment in time and give you a rest for a second there, Paul. Let me say hello and good evening to the various parties that are on our show this evening. Hello, Peter Secon. Good evening. Great to see you this evening. I hope Ari as well. Hello, Simon Huckle. Lovely to see you with us as well this evening. That's absolutely a delight. And hello to Anthony Clancy. Good to see you this evening as well. If you've got a question for Paul, then let us know. We'll be happy to take them in any of the feeds that we've got here that you can watch us on, which is, of course, Facebook, LinkedIn, and indeed YouTube, as we're going for around the world from front office to back with our special guest this evening, Paul Conn of Computershare. So, Paul, tell us, briefly, because I suspect quite a large number of people either they've heard the name Computershare, but they don't really quite understand what you do.
Okay, well, thank you for the opportunity. Computershare is a public company. It's now a very diversified organization. It is most known for providing share registration or transfer agency services to public companies, and indeed some private companies, and providing services on behalf of those companies as agent to the investors in those organizations. But it also has large operating divisions working in equity share plan and equity rewards administration, and a range of other verticals running from bankruptcy administration, class action administration. We have a large business in the corporate trust area. And so the organization now is, it's a global organization, operates in 21 markets, employs 14,000 people. It is 4 years older than life, so it's 44. Was founded in 1978 by Chris Morris, who's tremendous entrepreneur. He took the company public in 1994, listing the company on the ASX, and at that time, company had a market cap of around 36 million Australian dollars, and I think around 70 employees. Today, we're in 21 markets, 14,000 employees, and a market cap of around 15 billion Australian dollars. So over that period of time, there's been tremendous growth, moving obviously out of Australia into all of the kind of major capital markets around the world.
Yes, it's absolutely incredible and quite the amazing story altogether how Chris Morris and team managed to take such a small Australian business and really conquer the world through so many of these systems. And it is interesting because also, I mean, Computershare, you've had various different segues. I mean, I know it's not been your responsibility, but it's quite interesting because at one stage you were building exchange trading technology, if I remember correctly, and you've had lots of different businesses, many which worked out quite well. I mean, the exchange trading software you sold to OMX, if I remember correctly, now NASDAQ, which was quite successful. It's been quite an incredible journey around the world for the Computershare business.
Yeah, it really has. Chris Morris, very, very focused on technology and, driving technology to deliver efficiency and to give the company a kind of leading position. He could see that acquiring what was then financial market software consultants, I think they were called FMSC, they were building trading platforms and CSD solutions for markets. It was very logical for Chris to put these two businesses together. We had the trading technology business as part of the Computershare group for a considerable period of time. But once we got into the mid-2000s, it became quite clear that we were competing against some very different organizations, and it was easy for some of our competitors to position us as not in quite the same space as they were. And there was an opportunity to do a deal with OMX, and OMX acquired the trading technologies division from Computershare at that time. And OMX and NASDAQ then got together. So a lot of my colleagues are now still part of the NASDAQ group, or in the case of Peter Jessup, who is a dear friend and a very smart individual. He's moved on and is now doing other things in the capital market space. I think he's at LSEG now, which is, so he's ended up where I started.
There's an interesting message for you, Peter Jessup, when you're watching this.
That's front to back. I was like the centre forward, and gradually I've gone from a striker to a midfielder to a right back, and
Peter's been going the opposite way. Well, Peter's also got an interesting portfolio because he's on the board of NZX at the same time as working for the London Stock Exchange Group. So I mean, that's not even bi-coastal. I mean, that's bi-hemispherical. That's quite aggressive as a portfolio, isn't it? So okay, you explained to us what Computershare does. I mean, that's very interesting as a business. What exactly is your role within this huge group of 14,000 people?
So that's a very, very good question. I've been fortunate, obviously, worked for the company now for over 20 years. So my role has, been varied throughout parts of that time. But the core role and the core function that I fulfill running the global capital markets team at Computershare is really threefold. We do three things. The first thing is we help our clients, the corporations, with any type of cross-border business they have. So if they want to conduct a secondary listing in New York or in London, or they're doing cross-border M&A and they want to issue cash or securities to take a company private as a subsidiary, or or any type of cross-border transaction, the team I work with, they're all experienced individuals, great group of people. Through our network of working with our local partners on the ground, we're able to construct some pretty interesting solutions for our clients when they have these very, very challenging cross-border transactions. I can talk about some of them broadly as we move on. So that's really the first strand. The second strand is looking at market structure change, and this goes through cycles. We're now starting to go through, I think, what is an upcycle for market structure change. We're analyzing regulatory change, technological change, changes to the settlement process or the settlement period. There's now a big push coming from North America to push the US markets into a T+1 settlement system. Many changes to the way securities are legally transferred, or how corporate actions work, or how issuers communicate with their shareholders, how voting takes place at meetings. So we look at all of those things. The third area is what we call new business, and new business looks to kind of capitalize on some of the opportunities that have been created in the market by some of these market structure changes. And more recently, Computershare has invested in a fintech startup that's now maybe 2.5 years old, called Proximity, sitting alongside many large global banks. That's an interesting development. So they're the three things that I and my team do. I'm very lucky to have this role. I think it's partly to do with the fact that I've been around for a long, long time, even prior to joining the company, and I've worked in three major time zone regions, so I have a reasonable perspective of the marketplace from an infrastructure and process perspective. So that's what I do. I hope that helps.
Fabulous. I think that's a fabulous description altogether. It's so interesting. There's so much to drill down into, actually. I think I'm probably going to go perhaps backwards to go forwards. Tell us a little bit about this company, Proximity, because you made this transaction about, I think, a year or so ago, and you made an investment. And Proximity are kind of, it seems to me in one way, Proximity are hugely helpful to the world of capital markets, but at the same time, they're also almost eating into some of the things that you've been doing as a business in a slightly more old-fashioned process way, if I can say it that way.
Well, I'd like to see them as entirely complementary.
Right.
History will tell, but they ought to be entirely complementary. But stepping back, Proximity is a platform which is intended to connect issuers through their issuer agents, such as a registrar or transfer agent like Computershare. We obviously have thousands of corporate clients around the world who are trying to connect to millions of investors around the world, some of whom we know directly because they sit on our register through a direct registration process. Many of whom, however, we don't know because they sit through custody chains, through bank nominees, broker nominees. So the Proximity solution is really to use technology to connect the issuer agent and the investor agent, which is the custodian, to connect them more effectively together so that the issuer can communicate digitally through that chain to the investor. And so the investor can receive their information earlier, vote digitally, passes through the chain, very, very little friction, and ultimately the issuer will get the results of the the intentions much earlier in the process. That's the intention, and we've been able to prove that works. So that's good. The company is owned by a wide group of financial institutions, ranging from Bank of New York to Citi to Deutsche Börse, Clearstream, HSBC, JP Morgan, State Street, and more recently BNP Paribas, and an investor communications group in US known as Mediant Communication. So, really diverse group of people with deep interests in this marketplace, looking to make the process better. The custodians, I think, are reported to administer, I think, 70% of all assets that are invested globally. So connecting these communities of companies on the one hand and investors on the other, when they don't sit on the register, is entirely complementary to what Computershare does.
Very interesting. It's very interesting altogether. And it's one of those things that a lot of people don't really realize, which is that the way that a lot of these share registers work is that you don't ultimately say that Paul Conn or Patrick Young own shares in a particular entity, but you have all of these amazing nominee entities which have zillions of shares all the way through them that say that these people are the owners of the share, because it apparently helps brokers and other financial institutions to aggregate things in a slightly better fashion, or at least that's supposedly the theory as it went by. How do you see that working? I mean, in terms of the whole business, because clearly we've gone through a massive revolution. Computershares help power that in terms of organizing our ways all the way from paper ledgers onto computerized ledgers and so on. Do you think that in this world where, UBOs, I mean, finding out who actually owns an asset is so vitally important to the world's banks and so on, is that going to have an impact on the custody world and indeed the CSD world of stock markets?
So I think the short answer is yes, but I think the longer answer is you need to look at this in phases. And when I look at this from a kind of market design and from infrastructure perspective, when markets were predominantly paper-based, it made a lot of sense for securities to be centralized into broker nominees, and then for marketplaces to create central depositories. So brokers and banks would move their pools of securities into a larger pool. And that's how, book entry settlement was facilitated for many years. And I think what you're now seeing, and this is not something that's just happened in the last few months or a few years, this kind of pressure I think has been growing over the last decade or so. You now have a situation where the solutions that were designed for paper-based environments are now migrating into digital environments. And so the question is, do you change the model or do you just automate the process? And clearly now we have many organizations in the marketplace who operate for profit, and people will resist change. But there's always a way, I think, to ultimately balance off the needs of the different groups, so you can bring these technological efficiencies to bear. But I think it's a macro change over the next 5, 10, 15 years. I think there will be greater transparency. I think companies should know who owns them. I think investors should be able to communicate with them. But we need the chain of parties that act for the ultimate users of the marketplace to be able to transact with each other very efficiently.
Yes, it becomes, it's obviously quite a complex thing, and it's very difficult to manage to do in the work of a moment. And speaking about, people were great to see. Good evening, Patrick and Paul. Great to hear another expert vision for the world of exchanges coming from Beata Young there. And actually, talking about, the brave new world of what might be done, we've also got an excellent comment there from Martin Watkins, who's obviously working at Montes Digital. He's the CEO there, trying to create a blockchain-based CSD for digital securities. Patrick Young and Paul Conn looking forward to another highly informative and insightful IPO-VID tonight. Number 79 is particularly pertinent to the digital infrastructures we are building at Montes Group. Congratulations on the achievements at Proximity, Paul. Best regards, Martin Watkins. Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much, Martin. Good to hear from you, as always. Very interesting. So, I mean, Paul, there's obviously a huge amount of change to come. But also, I mean, there's been a lot of change happening in the way that stocks have actually been traded in the course of recent years, partly because of the ongoing digital revolution, partly one might also say because of COVID. So, I mean, has there been a big change all the way through to your end of the spectrum, thanks to things like the meme stock bubble?
Okay, well, that's quite a broad-ranging question. So the answer is yes, there's been incredible deployment of technology at the trading end of the marketplace. There is always deployment of technology in the post-trade environment. But I think what we have to remember is that post-trade, and indeed ownership and how ownership is conveyed, is generally, well, say generally, is always governed by the law of the land in which you are investing. So often, efficiencies have been able to be fully captured from a trading perspective, but from a post-trade perspective, the systems that have been designed have been built in a kind of paper-based world. So shares were immobilized and pushed into nominees so that book entry transfers could take place within these systems without having to record every transfer on a register that someone like Computershare registers. So to really move some of the post-trade components forward, there are governments that are looking to modify their laws to take the paper out of the system altogether. I mean, I think it's something the UK market is going to be studying over the course of the next 6 to 18 months to finally digitize the marketplace and eradicate share certificates. Now, that doesn't mean that it needs to eradicate a share registrar or an organization like Computershare. It just means we can bring technology fully to bear so that we can offer digital solutions to investors who are not intermediated through bank or broker chains.
Very interesting. And therefore, have you been impacted by any particular changes in the actual activity of retail investors themselves?
Well, I mean, and I didn't pick up on the meme stock comment, so thanks for giving me another opportunity to come back at that. I mean, in the context of the meme stock phenomenon, which we all saw and read about, it's very clear that millions of individual investors were participating through digital forums like Reddit and Discord and other communities where they could exchange ideas and information, and indeed in some cases strategies about what they should do. I'm probably not the best person to convey what actually happened, but it was largely around a perception there would be a short squeeze in the marketplace around a couple of securities because those securities had been shorted to such a very, very large extent, and that led to some very, very significant buying from retail investors. All of this is in the public domain, and so I won't bore you all with that, but that's the kind of broad context. What we have seen in the last 15 months is in the US environment, some of the retail investors have demanded withdrawal of their shares from the book entry system so they could take direct control. So rather than leave their shares in a broker nominee or the street system, as it's known in the US, they've asked the broker to register the individual directly on the books of the company, and which obviously we administer on behalf of our corporate clients, and we've seen tremendous growth in the number of direct registrations. To give you a sense, at the end of last year, this phenomenon in terms of taking control of the registration process started in around August, September last year. By December or January, cutting over into this year, we had seen across a couple of securities, tens and tens of thousands of investors take their securities out of the street system. And I commented at the time that there's not a single sports stadium in the US that could hold that group of people that have asked for direct title. And that process has just continued week by week, and it just carries on. There's probably not a stadium in the world anywhere that could hold this group of retail investors now. So it really is quite a phenomenon. I mean, there's people that say the meme stock phenomenon is dead. I think from an ownership and how people are holding their securities, there's still a group of very motivated individuals that want to take control of their own securities holdings and make their voice known to the company they invest in.
Well, it's very interesting, isn't it? Because a lot of that's to do with information channels. People having a live stream of a Tuesday evening, talking to each other from different parts of the world about markets, and all of those sorts of processes certainly completely changed the tenor of the market, where we've had electronic trading for 20 years. But the real difference, I think, as you said, in the last 5 or 7 years has been how much people have started talking to each other, whether it's on Telegram or Discord or Reddit or however that works. And I mean, we know from our own experience, we've got 800 and something active members of a Telegram group related to Valerium, the company I'm an executive director on. And that's just sensational. Thank you very much, Peter Sakon, for being such a great administrator of that group independently on behalf of the shareholders. But it's fascinating that you can have that, a cabal in a micro cap company. Obviously, when you start getting up to $10 billion plus companies like Computershare, it's quite fascinating. But let me ask you a question, and perhaps this is politically tricky. Why do you think that there has been this move of people wanting to take themselves out of the straight system and get things in their own name? Is it just paranoia? Is it something to do with succession or tax planning in the USA? Or is it just itself a meme phenomenon where they've been told this is a good idea and agreed it on the chat boards?
Well, it's partly the latter. However, I think there has been some very, very focused discussions between individuals, market commentators, and there really are two schools of thought here. And my own view is there isn't sufficient data available to anyone today to prove which side is right or wrong. And so you have the retail investors who believe that there are market players, participants who still have significant short positions and failed trades that haven't settled. And ultimately, those parties need to make good on the transactions that they've undertaken. In many cases, retail investors have had shares credited into their online accounts, and they want to be certain that the brokers are holding, underlying positions on a one-for-one basis. And I think, some of the weaknesses in a system that was created in the mid-70s are starting to come to light, and it's very difficult for one side to prove whether the other is right or wrong. So what the investors are doing, and this has largely come through, I think, some reasonably informed debate on some of these chat forums, which have got tens of thousands, some have got hundreds of thousands of participants, saying, well, the best way to ensure we own our shares is to register them in our own name. So we no longer have a claim against a broker or a securities entitlement that the broker is administering for us. We can own them directly. And that's an empowering thing for these investors.
It is an empowering thing for those investors. And I actually think it's a wonderful thing. I appreciate it causes some degree of paperwork expropriation for the brokers, and they've got to do all sorts of things. On the other hand, it's very good for you because it gets therefore a more accurate, some might say, share register in terms of actually knowing who the people are for the companies that you're dealing with, which is wonderful. It's also kind of a weird thing because when you look at the whole business of settlement of all of these different markets, one thing that shocks me is crowdfunding. I mean, crowdfunding's come along and they spend all of this time warning people not to risk their money. And everybody gets terribly excited and worried about people investing their money in the wrong way. And then what actually happens is they go through this incredible regulated process, even under Reg A, Reg CF, whatever in the USA. And while they're doing that whole thing, sorry, I'm extemporizing for a moment, but while they're doing that whole process, it's quite incredible because then you go to settlement, and the settlement can be some accountant in a porta cabin in Wyoming. No disrespect to Wyoming, but they can be in the middle of nowhere. They can have absolutely no responsibility virtually whatsoever. And in fact, even worse, I mean, if you're with some of the UK or European crowdfunding platforms, you basically get an IOU because they're one big nominee, the crowdfunding platform for all the investors. And so therefore, if the crowdfunding platform goes bust, you actually may not have your shares, which I find quite shocking given how sophisticated we have made the business of settling public shares. And for all the talk about private markets or early stage markets, they just haven't caught up so far.
Yeah, it's very, very, it's an interesting commentary that you make there. I think in the public markets, ultimately it's about giving investors choice. You know, they choose what they want to invest in, they choose who they want to transact through, they choose whether they hold their securities in an intermediated form or whether they want to seek direct registration. Now, in crowdfunding models and markets, you tend to have, you know, separate infrastructure that has been created purposely for that process, and so much has been focused on, you know, information dissemination, trying to bring investors together. I don't think there's been, you know, sufficient focus necessarily on the ownership model, and, you know, logically the same types of arrangements that apply in the public market should apply in the private market. It's a scale issue. I think one of the reasons why this separate infrastructures, you know, has been or have been created is because people are prepared to invest money to create these marketplaces because they want to create the focus on the crowdfunding opportunity. But ultimately, you need to make sure that you're offering the same type of systemic protection to the people who are participating. And, you know, certainly some of these areas in, you know, talking about the US, really ultimately you want parties to be regulated if they're looking after investors' assets, however they're being recorded, whether it's through a custody arrangement or, you know, recording title. At least if you're recording title, you should be able to pass it over to someone else to administer going forward, even if the operator goes bust.
Yeah, absolutely, because otherwise you've just got a huge degree of counterparty risk in the system, which, okay, is not going to be systemic, but it's not very helpful if you've invested in a portfolio of small or startup companies or whatever you've been doing, which is obviously a problem. We've got just a little, around about 15 minutes left on the clock this evening, ladies and gentlemen. We've got one or two questions to run, which I'm going to be asking Paul. Paul Conn is our guest this evening. He's one of the leading lights at Computershare. We're talking about, well, markets from front to back around the world, and it's been a thoroughly interesting conversation so far. And here's one of those questions from Anthony Clancy. Thank you very much, Anthony. Well, Paul, this is a bit of a diversion, so see what you make of this question. In your expert opinion, given your experience with many exchanges around the world, how quickly can a new exchange with up-to-date technology, regulated into the evolving crypto, NFT, blockchain space, potentially become a billion-dollar company? Gosh, have you got something you'd like to opine on that, perchance, Paul?
Well, I had a formulation in my mind, and it's probably not appropriate to share that. But I mean, seriously, if I knew the answer to that, I wouldn't be doing what I am doing at the company. I would be doing other things. Look, I to try and answer the question, leaving the dollar figure aside, I think so much of this evolves around the development of a regulatory framework that allows crypto or non-fungible tokens to be transferred. It's not a tech issue from my perspective. I think it's really a regulatory issue, and these things need to fit together effectively so that people can create these new marketplaces and thrive. But I'm sorry, I can't answer the question about how quickly it would become a billion-dollar company, and I hope you understand.
Well, I think I'm with you there, Paul. I think if we could all answer that question, then we'd be
we wouldn't be talking.
We're probably not talking here this evening. We'd be somewhere in our yacht. Yes, far flung places, enjoying a cold one in the tropics. Yes, I can imagine. Quite incredible. So we've also got, I do believe, something just come in from Martin Watkins. I do believe. 20 plus years ago, an Asian stock exchange had 50 million individual account holders. Regulations since then focused on restricting access to legal entities. Do you see digital securities driving the re-emergence of natural persons, i.e. investors holding their own securities? Asks Martin Watkins.
I think that's a great question, and I tried to talk about this thematically earlier. I do think the models that are used within CSDs and registers can be relooked at with the advent of new technologies and ultimately new regulation, or suitable regulation. My own view is that investors should be able to hold securities directly, whether that's a digital security, an electronic entry for an equity, or a paper-based security, albeit we're all working very hard to take paper out of the system. So, I mean, I don't see any reason why we could not move to a system whereby there are large numbers of retail investors. I think really the issue will come down to how do you construct the marketplace, and are large financial intermediaries critical to the success of your marketplace? If they are, it's highly likely that many of them will like to administer their client holdings around different holding structures. And ultimately, if you have choice of direct ownership or indirect ownership, I think you can get the balance right. If you're forcing direct individual account ownership on all users of the system, there's going to be, in my view, some resistance to the take-up, depending on how important the existing financial market players are to the success of your infrastructure. So I've kind of talked around it. I hope I give you a little bit of a flavour for the view.
Interesting question that spins up, which is, I mean, you've been talking about this whole idea of people taking their shares out of the street system in the US, they're putting them into their own names on registers and so on. How important, or where do you actually view the advantages, or are there advantages to the distributed ledger in this whole thing? I mean, do we need it, or can you convincingly carry on with existing ledger technologies?
That's a really good question, and clearly, the work that's been done in the Australian marketplace over the last 5 or 6 years has been trying to answer that particular question. I mean, a number of parties around the world are looking at blockchain and DLT to revolutionize the post-trade environment. I think, if you look at this from a theoretical perspective, many markets have distributed layers today and rely on reconciliation points between different layers and different parties in the chain. Now, you could well say, well, let's just put that all on a distributed ledger, and the ledger and the integration of ledgers will take care of that overnight. And I think theoretically that is, that is right. I think the challenge is trying to retrofit these technologies into existing marketplaces, and I'm talking about the players in the marketplace as opposed to the technology that it replaces. I think that's where the real challenge comes from. My own view is you don't necessarily need DLT to deliver efficiencies in these marketplaces. There are other existing technologies that can improve some of the arrangements to ensure that people in the street are holding shares, and they're fully covered, and they have absolute confidence in that process. I don't think you need a DLT for that. A DLT or a blockchain is great when you have an environment that is completely non-trusted, but when you have trusted authorities in the middle and a regulated activity, I think the blockchain or the DLT can still bring some benefits. But from my perspective, it's not clear whether it's wholesale transformation of the marketplace, or whether it's evolutionary steps that the market will take to provide efficiencies. So that's, I think, the tug of war, and the next 5 years will prove, how that all unfolds.
That, I think, is, yeah, it's a really, really interesting question. It's a very, very interesting issue in terms of how that ultimately will fold out. But I'm hearing you. I mean, the idea that totally the only answer to every question is blockchain, I find a little bit worrying when people say that that's the ultimate savior of all things. But it has got incredible advantages in certain areas. But it's not necessarily everything. And it's going to be difficult making it focus into the existing practices, which is quite key. Now, talking about actually the existing practices, we've got a question here from Beate Young of A Woman on It, whose live stream will be on tomorrow at 12 midday New York time at 6 p.m. London time. She's talking about, I do believe, compliance and related things for small businesses with her guest. She's asking, so since Computershare offer flexible hours, remote working, and paid volunteer leave, how do you manage your teams, Paul? And given the fact that actually, well, you're today in London, but you're normally based in New York.
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. And the team that I run, the capital markets team, has been in formation since 2006, and we had kind of predecessors to that a few years prior to that. But since 2006, we've had a group of people dotted around the world who are focused on different strands of the business unit and different disciplines within that. Ultimately, it comes down to trust. You have to hire people who can do the job, hopefully like doing the job and want to progress, but ultimately you'll have to trust one another. And if you're responsible individuals, you'll find a way to work very, very effectively together. The team I am very, very lucky to lead has been working on a distributed basis for many, many years. For us as individuals, COVID was not really an issue. Obviously, COVID was very challenging from a health perspective, but from the ability to continue working from home, it really didn't have any impact on the group that operates in what we call GCM, the capital markets group, because they've always been working on a distributed, different time zone basis. They have the ability to be flexible in terms of when they work and get their jobs done. So I hope that helps.
Well, actually, on that front, I have to say, I would thoroughly applaud you in Computershare. At this juncture, Yin and your PR is going to be jumping up and down and thinking, good grief, what's he applauding you for? But the thing that you're being applauded for was the fact that nobody heard anything about Computershare during COVID. And that was great, as far as I'm concerned, because it meant everything worked. In the same way that actually the parish of exchanges did sensationally well, and all of those interactions from the front end through the back end and through the Computershare element functioned unbelievably well at a time of obscene number of messages. So I hugely applaud you for not being mentioned at any point in time during COVID, because that's really, really vital. I think that we see such an important and useful and beneficial follow through. That leads me to, of course, the great final question, Paul. So you may remember that a long, long time ago, some Irish bloke wrote a book called Capital Market Revolution, and it is his habit to ask you at the end of his show, where do you think the revolution goes next?
Well, thank you. I think there are three things. I think retail is here to stay. People talk about the rise of retail and what drives that. Part of it is access to markets. Is very, very easy now. Access to information, access to exchange ideas and collaborate. So I think the rise of retail is, a phenomenon that is just here and it's here to stay, and people will become more and more organized in the way in which they, conduct their business, whether it's how they want to respond to a particular company in a shareholder meeting, a particular resolution. They find each other. So, the internet's fundamentally changed communications. We all know that. But I think the rise of retail is here to stay. I think we touched on this earlier. Transparency of ownership chains, I think, has been a phenomenon that's been slow to fundamentally change, but it is gathering pace. And I think in the past, it's always been about, having more transparency means the people in the middle need to get out of the way. And I think what has happened in the last decade is the technology has actually moved to an extent where the intermediaries and agents that are in the chain can actually stay in the chain, and data and information can pass through from issuers to investors and vice versa very, very effectively. So I think the technology will allow for greater transparency of who owns what. And the final point is, I just think you're going to hear a lot more about digitization, just more generally. And I think it will become more prevalent than discussion about blockchain and DLT. I'm not saying that blockchain and DLT won't have their role in securities markets. They will. I think it will still take time, but digitization, I think, is going to become a term that people are going to continue to be talking about over the next 2, 5, 10 years, and it's going to drive, a lot more change in the marketplace and how people interact with the markets.
Ladies and gentlemen, that's our show for this evening. As Ian Miller says, great night tonight. Thanks so much. I thoroughly echo those comments entirely. It's been an absolutely superb live stream this evening with Paul Conn from the head of the president of Computershare's Global Capital Markets Group. It only remains for me to say thank you very much to our commenters this evening, Peter Second, Simon Huckle, Anthony Clancy, Martin Watkins and Beata Young. We're looking forward next week to a great show with a man who himself has worked on multiple different continents. I'm not even sure where he'll be next week. Quite possibly in Astana, where he's generally been working recently. Olivier Guéris, building better markets all over the world. He's another man that built an exchange in Australia once upon a time. It seems to be a theme of recent weeks on this show. So what can we say about today, ladies and gentlemen? Well, I echo actually what Paul's saying about the revolution. Retail is here to stay. Transparency, particularly of ownership, is going to be a huge theme. And the digitization of markets is going to be something that we can look forward to for the future, for the exciting days to come. This has been show number 79. We'll be back next week. My name is Patrick L. Young. Thank you very much to our guest, Paul Conn. It's a wrap. I wish you all, ladies and gentlemen, a great week in blockchain life and markets. My name is Patrick L. Young.